We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Kate and Abbie Show. We're so stoked to have you here for this super special story mining episode all about how to craft better sub-characters. So sub-characters can often take a backseat and become what feels like filler. They sometimes feel like padding to make the story go by. Like, we can't spend too much time on the mains because the story will go by too fast. So let's throw in a few sub-characters into the mix. Sometimes they act as comic relief or the sidekick that helps the main character to make it to their goal. But more often than not, the subs can feel a bit flavorless and lacking with no perceivable desires, fears, or misbeliefs, internal conflict that is imperceptible to the reader and often the main character themselves. But sub-characters also have the potential to add exciting, multifaceted layers to your story, thickening the plot, adding juicy conflict, and quite possibly making your readers wish these subs were mains. Today, we're going to dive into the key elements that will make your sub-characters just completely next level. So that's what we're going to be diving into. But First, we have to thank our sponsors, who are you guys. You're the ones who support this show and keep it going, and we so appreciate your help. So if you get value out of this podcast, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show and help us keep this show alive and free of interruptions. Okay, let's dive into it. Like Kate said, this is going to be a story mining episode, so we're going to use some story examples and kind of case study some of our favorite examples of subplots that really shine and figure out like why they work. And this is one of my favorite things to do just as a writer, learning experientially from your favorite stories. It's so valuable to notice those stories that really tug on your heartstrings and really make you capture your attention. Yes. Yeah, make you fall in love with the characters and to ask yourself, okay, what is it about that? Like, what are those ingredients? Is there a science to that? Can we break that down? So that's what we're going to do today. Exactly. So if, like Abbie said, this is a story mining episode, so we're going to use examples, which you can of course listen to on any other platform. But if you want to see the clips that we'll be using from some of these shows and films, go over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/KAMins, and you'll be able to watch the examples. So it kind of gives you that extra layer. If you're like, what is it that they're talking about? You can see a little bit more in depth what we're talking about. And of course, we encourage you guys, go check out these examples and watch the shows, read the books, watch the films for yourself, because they're really great examples of these storytelling components, and we encourage you to delve deeper. Mm-hmm. So what makes a sub-character compelling? First and foremost, I think, backstory.
Yes. Yeah. For sure.
That's one of the key elements.
You have to know who this character is and where they come from.
Because honestly, well, isn't it kind of like the rules that apply to your main character apply to your sub-character?
Right, yeah. And even if you're not going as deep into their internal conflict and their past as you would for a main character, it's still good to touch on them, especially if they're going to have a lot of screen time. And I use air quotes to say that, because if you're just writing a book, same rules apply. The more focus you give a character, the more context you want to give the reader so they understand why they should care about this character. And like you said, backstory is a fundamental to that, because we have to know where this character came from to understand the context of why they believe what they believe. And what they believe really shapes who they are, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's their internal conflict, right? What is true to them?
Yeah, exactly.
What's their misbelief or their fatal flaw? What do they want and what are they afraid of?
And that's the second point, is internal conflict.
Yes.
And honestly, wouldn't you say that backstory and internal conflict are kind of like holding hands?
Yes, for sure.
Because it's the backstory that created the internal conflict.
Yeah. It's shaped
where
them
they've come up to
the
this
character
point. Yes.
that they are today.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Right, exactly. So when we can see a glimpse, and like Abbie was just saying, it's not like you have to spend loads of time on the backstory. It can be small bits and pieces that help us to glimpse, okay, I get where this character is coming from, as opposed to a character that feels two-dimensional. I really think that's one of the defining factors between a two-dimensional sub-character and one that's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see more of this subplot with this sub-character, is that we see their backstory, we see their internal conflict, we see what's brought them to this point and why they're doing what they're doing.
Yes.
And number 3, a goal of their own. Giving your sub-character a goal of their own. Because, and I've been thinking about this because like we watched a few films recently, and I was thinking about how the sub-characters had absolutely no goal whatsoever. It was just like whatever the goal of the main character was. It's like, oh, we're here to help. And it's like,
why do they need to be in the story? That's what I always ask,
it's like
writers who are struggling with the side characters. It's ask yourself, why does this character need to be in the story? Not why do you need them to be in the story? Not why does the protagonist need them to be there? But why do they specifically need to enter the story for their own reasons? You know?
Exactly. So they actually, it's their story too. It's not just, I happen to be in someone else's story. You know what I mean? That's what makes it feel realistic is because when you think about it, you're the main character of your own life, and all your friends and family are sort of like sub-characters in your story, but they all have just as much of their own story as you do, and they're the main characters of their own stories, right? So it's the same exact thing with the characters in your story, and that's what's going to make it feel realistic, is to not just make them all bland, flavorless characters that only exist to serve the main character.
Yeah.
Sounds slightly narcissistic. But they each are main characters in their own stories, even if we're not seeing tons of it.
Right. Yeah. And some stories even like do the opposite, where the main character is really bland and has like, you don't care about them at all, but one of the sub characters will be really great. And like, oh my gosh, the story should have been about them.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
It feels like they have the main character energy.
Yeah. I can
the main
think
character
of like
doesn't.
2 shows right off the top of my head that I watched.
Yeah.
Solely for subplots with sub characters.
Yeah.
That's I don't really care about the main character that much. But I'm like waiting to see what happens with the sub character.
For sure. Yeah.
So like some great examples of all 3 of these components being used really well. I think our first example would be from the new BBC miniseries. Not miniseries. It's not a miniseries. It's just like a full-length series.
Yes, thankfully.
Season 3
so
is coming soon. All Creatures Great and Small, the new adaptation that is currently airing.
It's so good. It's a masterclass in subplots, especially I would say the way that the subplots unveil the side characters. I should say it's kind of interchangeable when I say subplots and side characters, because the side characters anchor the subplots. The subplots,
right? The subplots are what's happening to the sub
exactly. But the way that show really, we first start the show with main protagonist James, and he's really the entry into the whole world, right? That's the character we see everything happening through his perspective. But then as he meets other characters who are important to his story, we start to care about those characters, and then we start to branch off. Eventually we start to branch off to those characters and follow them as, like you were saying, the heroes of their own stories.
Yes.
Sort of thing. And the main sub-characters are Siegfried, Mrs. Hall, and Tristan. And Tristan is the brother of Siegfried. He is like one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, me and Abbie cannot shut up about how much we love this character. He's our comfort character.
He is. He really is. His subplot and also Mrs. Hall, I think, were the ones that you wrote down as like 2 very strong side characters who don't take away from the main character at all, but have their own really richly developed characters and goals and internal conflict, really.
Right, because we see how they affect the main character. They're very immediate in the main character's life. They are both helping to move the main character's story forward and the larger story as a whole. They're very, very intimately connected to moving that storyline forward. But at the same time, they have their own stories, their own narratives. And we can clearly see, very artfully woven into the main plot line, what their desires and fears and misbeliefs are.
Yeah. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with the story, it's so good. You should just go watch it. But
yeah, it's so, and it's perfect for this time of, like, I know some of you guys, it's like still warm, it's warm weather for where you are in the world, but like for us right now, it's like kind of fall, and it's like the perfect cozy show.
yeah, it is so cozy.
It's like the most comforting,
so
cozy
feel-good.
show ever. It
Yeah,
is. It really is.
It's like a warm cup of tea. But the main premise is it follows the main character, James Harriet, who is a vet, and he goes to work for a vet in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's kind of out of his comfort zone at first.
New assistant. Oh, aye?
Another one. Mr. Finance, new assistant.
Another one.
Let's put forward.
And the vet he goes to work for, Siegfried, is kind of eccentric. He has an eccentric way of doing business.
Harriet!
Siegfried's bark really is worse than his bite. Underneath it all, he's a good man. Stand up to him. He'll love you for it.
And he's a cool guy, but he's a bit scattered and demanding, and he kind of is kept in line by his housekeeper, Mrs. Hall, who is a very grounded, very stable person, and she's just very nurturing and kind and sweet, and she kind of at first seems like sort of a very side character in that she doesn't seem to have much of a active role in the story, but we slowly start to see how she really does have a lot of influence in the events of what happens during the story, and a lot of influence also over Siegfried.
Right.
when he's a bit kind of closed off and apathetic, she appeals to his softer side.
Tristan seems to have turned over a new leaf. In fact, I'd say he's turned over a whole garden of them.
And then we have...
She kind of balances all the other characters.
Yeah, she does.
She's like, the relationships she has with each character are so different and unique and complex, which adds to the realisticness of the feeling too, because if you think about it, you have different relationships with all the people in your life. It's not like your relationships are all the same, you know what I mean? It adds complexity, and that feeling of it's so realistic. And I think that's a mistake that can be made with a lot of sub characters, is they're kind of the same to everyone.
Yeah.
Whereas you take a character like Mrs. Hall, and she's a bit of a mom to Tristan.
Yeah.
And she's like always encouraging and kind of mentoring James. And she's like the kite string that keeps Siegfried grounded and from flying off the handle every other second. So she has these very complex and different relationships with each one.
Yes.
With each character.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's something that I've been focusing on a lot more when I'm building characters. And I recently talked about this in my last live training, my Preptober live training, is when I go about crafting characters, I focus way more on the relationships now more than I used to. Like, even just, figuring out, even just if I'm, ranting in a document to myself of what kind of relationships does this character have with every other character in the story, because figuring out those relationships is really what makes it feel realistic, and it will change the way that you write the story. So, for example, if you're writing about like two sisters, and maybe one sister's kind of protective of the other one, or one sister's jealous of the other one. Well, those are two very different relationships that will completely change the way you write the story. So I think it's important to figure that out ahead of time, even beyond just, the character profile and the character's personal internal conflict. Well, how do they interact with other characters? What do these other relationships mean to them?
Right. Exactly.
So that's also
that adds
else.
so much to the mood and the flavor of the story. That's what's going to be some of the takeaways from the larger story itself.
Yeah.
Is the relationships. And you see the same thing with Tristan as a character.
Oh my gosh, yes, for sure. A
Like,
lot of relationship conflict there, especially with his older brother Siegfried, because he has this kind of inferiority complex a little bit secretly, that he looks up to Siegfried and he wants to make Siegfried proud of him, and we see that desire so clearly. And he's constantly kind of struggling with his lazy tendencies and his vices, but we see that he has a good heart and he tries really hard.
He's so flawed and so lovable.
Yes.
And that's he's just such a great example of a character who's like, their flaws and their their lovability combined to just be addictive. Addictive character. They feel so real. You feel like you know this person.
And you can see like the history of their relationship.
Right. And there's this interesting dynamic of Siegfried's a lot older than him, and they lost their parents, I think, at a relatively early age for Tristan. So Siegfried kind of has acted as older brother and dad almost in raising Tristan.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Hall kind of has this mother relationship with him. So there's a lot of complexity to their relationships with the other characters and who they are to each other. And it's just like, it's just that magic element.
Yes, it's so good. So good. Definitely check out All Creatures Great and Small if you haven't already. It is such a cozy, wonderful show, suitable for all ages. It's so lovely.
Yeah, it is extremely lovely and amazing sub-characters. Great. It's just a masterclass, as Abbie said. The next example we have is Dr. Ennis from the show Poldark, which we've mentioned probably 1,000 times collectively between this podcast and Abbie's own videos and teachings.
Yeah.
Poldark is based off of the novels by Winston Graham. And it aired on BBC Masterpiece. It's an insanely good show set in like the late 1700s. You could probably like paraphrase this better than I could. You've done it so many times.
It's a lot to paraphrase, but it focuses around the main character, Ross Poldark, who is a British soldier newly returned from the Revolutionary War, and kind of his whole life ends up being in shambles once he gets back home, but he sort of picks up the pieces and starts a new life for himself. And we see that he's a very heroic character in that he cares about other people. He's always fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, and we see that he's ultimately, has a good heart, even though he makes some bad decisions and is flawed for sure. And then Dr. Ennis, one of his best friends, kind of comes into the show. I think it's on episode 5. Of season 1.
Yeah.
So it's pretty early on that he comes into the show, but I think they did a great job of introducing him.
Yeah, the pacing was really well done.
It was, we've been well established with the main characters, and then it's like, okay, and now we have a new side character, and we clearly see how he's related to Ross because he's his best friend. He patched up his face when he got injured on the battlefield, and so there's like a little bit of past history there, a little bit of relationship history, and then we start to see Dr. Ennis as a character kind of standing on his own as a character and having his own subplots.
Right.
Which we then care about by extension because we know how they matter to Ross. And Ross is like the measuring device that we measure all the importance of everything else in the story
All
by.
the sub-characters really start coming, like we were saying a minute ago, the pacing is so well done because, like Abbie was saying, we're measuring everything through the perspective of the main character. And it's like as the characters become relevant to our main character, our main protagonist, those sub-characters start coming in. And so it feels so well paced because it's like, okay, yeah, we would naturally want to see more about that because we see why it matters to the main characters. So that's how we're kind of introduced to all of these sub-characters. So Dr. Ennis becomes almost like his storyline, especially in season 2, is so strong that you care about it just as much as you care about the main characters.
I'm a gentleman, sir.
And she is an heiress.
If you imagine that no man without an eye to her inheritance could fall in love with your niece, then you greatly underrate her charms and insult us both.
Yeah, and I also love how they're always like, their stories are always interweaving. You're never like going off to a different location for a long period of time with Dr. Ennis, in another country or something, seeing what he's doing. It's like, it's all very closely related to the events that Ross is involved in, you know? And so a lot of times they're like working together to, break a prison or something,
Right, exactly.
They're going about doing things together, and we can clearly see that connection.
Exactly. And then how they use Dr. Ennis's eventual romantic relationship with Caroline Penvenin is actually kind of a catalyst to help bring Ross and Demelza's marriage back together. Yeah. So it's like their relationships kind of run parallel, and when Ross feels like compelled to bring their relationship back together because he feels kind of responsible for it falling apart, that's sort of what brings him and Demelza back together. Yeah. Him and his wife, who had been having like a rocky time in their marriage. It kind of like brings him to this realization of like, you know, things can get better. So it's so relevant. They keep the character of Dwight Ennis so relevant to the main character throughout.
Yeah, and you care about him because you can clearly see like what he wants, his goals, his desires, some of his flaws, but he's like ultimately a very lovable character, I think.
And his backstory is like roots into the main character's backstory. Right. It's actually pulling from the main character's backstory, and so we have like this cool backstory of, oh, okay, you know, we have this backstory with the main character, which is really cool.
Yeah.
To be able to be like, oh, let's pull in someone from the main character's past.
Mm-hmm. You can clearly see the relevancy.
Right. Definitely. And a goal of their own. Like, that's super relevant. We see right away, like, what he wants in life. We see his struggles as he deals with his own flaws and demons to overcome obstacles standing in his way from. And his goal is similar to the main character, too. Yeah. So all of that's, like, overlapping.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. Definitely a good example. Go watch Poldark if you haven't already. And if you haven't already, then you just haven't heard us talk about it enough.
Like,
clearly
not. And to pull from a book example, I'm going to pull from my own book here, The Blood Race. If you don't know about my series, urban fantasy series, The Blood Race, from book 1, the sub-character of Finn, who when I first began writing the book, Finn was just a fellow slider in the dimension with the other protagonists, and he was totally a sub-character and someone that wasn't going to become anything that big, any main protagonist in the story, but he actually evolved so much that I gave him his own point of view in the second book and then in the third book, and he's actually, I think, one of the best loved characters. And in the last 2 books I just released, Searching for Sparrow and Sparrow Rising, he plays a pretty big role in those 2 books even occurring. So it's interesting. It was interesting to write because, and some of you who have read my series know what I'm talking about here, but he is kind of an instrumental aspect of one of the main characters, like his friendship with one of the main characters and how that main character is developing and growing. He's very relevant to the main characters, but as time goes on, it's like he sort of develops a storyline of his own.
Yeah, I think for sure everyone loves Finn. I love Finn.
Yeah.
He's a great character. And even in book 1, you know, you introduced him with showing, you know, some of his backstory and the difficult choices that he had to make throughout that book. Particularly like with leaving his family behind. Spoiler alert. Sorry. You know, exactly. Like making personal sacrifices for the greater good of what he believes in.
Right.
Which I think really, you know, shows his character development and also gives a relatability to his character.
Yeah. And we see some of his backstory because he was trained by one of the main protagonists, Hawk. And so we hear about his backstory and how they trained together. He was one of the first sliders to be initiated into the Dimension, which is this place of training for these anomalies of Earth, these protectors of Earth. And so we see some of his backstory, his relevancy to the main character. We see right away his internal conflict, what makes him tick, how he's very family oriented. His family is the most important thing to him. And that's what makes his decisions as time goes on, and having to leave his family behind, that's what makes the decision all the more gut-wrenching because we've already established how much that means to him. What are the things that matter to him the most in life? And that's really what, if you're writing a sub-character and you're like, or really any character, you're like, how do I come up with the internal conflict? Honestly, you can simplify that question with asking yourself, what matters the most to this character in their life? Yeah. That's really how you can kind of find the internal conflict. I mean, when you think of yourself as a human being, like what matters to you the most in your life? And then boom, that's what's going to motivate. Every single decision you make is going to be based around that thing that is the most important to you, and preserving that and protecting that and moving that forward.
Yeah, and for any writer who feels like a little bit lost or confused on like how to show that, because I know it's easy enough to like write it into a character profile, but how do you then show your reader that without just coming out and telling them? And what I always try to remember, and it's the rule for life as well, is that actions speak louder than words. So you don't even need to tell me what this character believes. You just need to show me them acting upon their beliefs. So what do they do? What are the actions they take to continue to prioritize those things that matter to them?
For more on that, see our show versus tell episode.
That was a really good episode. If you guys want to,
that was a popular episode too. A lot of you guys chatted with us about how you liked that. So if you want to see more like spin-off topics from that in the future, let us know. And for Finn too, like we, as time went on, you saw how his own goal manifested. He had a goal outside of just the main character's goal. Like, sure, it tied into the moving the story forward, but he also had his own thing going. He had his own motivations and the things that were drawing him forward through the story, the things that made him tick. And that's actually the whole spin-off series of Sparrow, Searching for Sparrow and Sparrow Rising. The Sparrow books are basically the manifestation of his own unique motivations throughout the story. So remember that when you're writing a series, the motivation of a sub-character might become a second series. It might become a follow-up book or a sequel. We've seen that so many times. I mean, I think you were reading a book recently. I can't remember what it was, but it was like, there's the main series and then it's like, oh, and then there's these other books with sub-characters. That's like a pretty common thing these days.
Yeah.
So when you have a sub-character that's like, they're a strong character in the story, they have backstory, they have internal conflict, they have a goal of their own. That's what's going to connect the reader to that sub-character on a whole nother level that might even propel you into writing additional books or writing an additional series or film, whatever medium you're working with here. Remember that, you know, that this is all extra material that could take on a life of its own.
Right. Very true.
And then for our final film example, we're going, well, film, but it's a book, but I always think of the film because I haven't read the book. Abbie's read the book, I think.
Yes, I have.
I think I might have listened to the audiobook once in the distant past, but I can't remember. Jane Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to let Abbie take this one because this is Abbie's like golden rule example.
I know.
Here.
I've used it so many times, but it never gets old because it is so good.
Relevant.
Such a solid example.
So relevant.
Honestly, everything Jane Austen is like a masterclass in side characters.
Yeah.
But and I've talked about the side characters of Pride and Prejudice so much because of this, because they are so well written and so relevant to the protagonist's story, especially the character of Jane Bennet. So if you know the story, you know that it's mostly about Elizabeth and Darcy, of course, but Jane's subplot becomes very relevant and in fact, like, essential to Elizabeth's plot because it's everything that happens with Jane on the side, with Jane and Bingley, ends up directly impacting Elizabeth's plot and her story, particularly with Darcy's interference with Jane's love life because he doesn't want Bingley, his friend, to be with Jane. So he's like, yo, you know, that family's no good for you. Don't want to see that happen. You should just kind of end that. And that ends
honestly, it's like the whole mechanism.
Yes. It throws this huge monkey wrench into his own relationship with Elizabeth. And he's like, you know what? I can even overlook this for myself. What a compliment. I can overlook how degrading your family is because I love you, Elizabeth, so much. Please marry me. And she's like, are you kidding me? You just destroyed my sister's happiness. I could never marry you. And that's really like the pivotal, game-changing midpoint of Pride and Prejudice.
Anything might tempt me to accept the man who has ruined, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister. You deny it, Mr. Darcy.
is Darcy's failed proposal.
Like, no one thinks about, I wonder, like, okay, Bingley's point of view there. Like, hey, you just told me that I couldn't be with her sister, and then you go and do that. Like, I would be super mad.
That's pretty lame.
Bingley would be like, I thought we were friends, man. Not anymore. Like,
for real.
I've never thought of that before until this moment. But like Bingley, I can see him feeling super jaded over that.
Yeah, I would for sure. For sure. He's a very forgiving character. That's why he and Jane go well together.
Right.
But yeah, that's what ends up being like this pivotal moment that ends up like changing the course of the whole plot.
Yeah.
You know, and then Darcy's redemption really is him helping Lydia as well. And she's another great example of a side character, her and Wickham, even though Wickham's more of a antagonist, but both really well written side characters. But it's really Darcy's act of mending the relationship between Jane and Bingley at the end that shows Elizabeth he's changed as a character. It proves his transformation. It shows him that he really is her equal and that she loves him. And it's like it all culminates into this beautiful climactic confrontation / aha moment. And that's what makes it so memorable, is that this side plot really is what it is. These side characters came together to create this side plot, which then worked as the plot device that ended up changing the main characters as a result of their journey. It's so beautiful. Like that's just, it's a perfect example of the side plots done well and with characters who are very much the heroes of their own story on the side. You know, characters that we can clearly see who they are, what they believe, what they want, what they're afraid of, and they're not just being used as pawns in the protagonist's game. They're living their own lives, but in doing so, they are creating this whole plot, this whole story for the main characters that makes the whole thing more memorable.
Right. They totally have their own separate journeys. They have their own backstory. They have their own internal conflict, their own goals. But at the same time, it ties in so seamlessly to the main characters, our main protagonist, and their own journey and the overarching plot of the story as a whole, moving that forward. But it feels so natural and so real. These characters feel so believable. And all of it feels so seamless. None of it feels forced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I go way deeper into the whole subplot of Pride and Prejudice, and also just ways to integrate subplots into your own story in my live training about how to write unforgettable subplots. So if you haven't seen that live training, you can still watch it. It happened a few months ago, but it's still in the archives of my trainings, which is loaded with value. And if you want to get deeper into subplots and developing your side characters, definitely check that out, because it's just has so much good stuff in there. And I also use other story examples, but I go deeper into the Jane subplot because I show you guys like how I personally plot my subplots and side characters, and how to take like your outline for your main character and their journey and make room for, find places where the side characters' journeys and the subplots can seamlessly fit in with your main character's journey. And that to me is like the most tricky part, because you can like make these side characters profiles and stuff and figure out like how they're going to change as a result of the journey, but how do you weave it all together? And so that's what we dig into in that training.
Because that's something you do want to avoid is, and we've seen shows before where it's like, it feels almost like you're watching two movies that happen to be glued together.
Yes.
And neither one of these characters really affects the other, but it's like, oh, this is happening over here and this is happening over here. And are they related? I don't know. Will they ever like cross paths? Not sure, but we're like watching these two people doing these two separate things and we're not really sure why. So we want to kind of avoid that.
Yeah, because what ends up happening is you want to skip.
Yes.
You want to skip the subplot that you don't care about.
Right.
And you don't want that happening for sure.
Exactly. You want it to all seamlessly cross paths and tie together in a harmonious way. And not only, I mean, when people sign up for your live trainings, they're not only getting access to the archives of all the trainings that have gone by, but you're also going to be able to see your live trainings as they come up, because this is something you regularly do.
Yes. So it is a part of my Patreon community, so you can find that at patreon.com/Abbie Emmons, by the way. Forgot to say that first. But when you join at the live training pass level, you get access to my whole archive of previous live trainings and all my future live trainings. So that's why I call it the live training pass, because it is the pass to all of them. Creative name, right? and it's so much fun, because especially if you're on the lives,
it's like a community.
You get to participate in
aspect.
The conversation. So at the end of each live training, I always have a Q&A segment where every person who's watching the live training can chat with me live, and I answer your questions, and we kind of discuss what we went over in the training in greater detail as it pertains to your particular story. So that to me is super fun. It's super valuable to any writer out there who's feeling a little bit lost, like you need a little bit more guidance on certain specific topics. That's what this is for. It's
basically like getting together for a little writing seminar / retreat every month virtually.
Yeah, every month. And it's really great, because we get to have that conversation and go deeper than we do on my YouTube channel. So,
and then beyond that, don't they get access to like the Discord?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Discord,
which I'm totally unfamiliar with what Discord is. Like I hear Abbie mention, I'm like, oh yeah, the Discord. I don't know what that is.
It's super fun. It's super fun. It's like a writer's clubhouse where we all get to hang out and chat and do writing sprints together, share about our stories, and brainstorm. It's super fun. And also you get access to the Inner Circle Facebook group, which is a private Facebook group for writers, and we have a lot of members in there now too, and that's another great place to share ideas and connect and talk to other writers just like you all over the world. It's super fun, great community, and there's a bunch of valuable templates and printables and a whole bunch of other valuable resources inside of the Patreon community.
Yeah, it's been so cool to see how many writers have met each other and crossed paths and become beta readers for each other and buddies, and from your channel or from the podcast or from your inner circle. And so it's a cozy, high vibe community. It really is.
It is.
So we went over a lot in today's episode, but I think this is going to give you guys a really good foundation, and I hope you took some notes, or mental notes anyway. And this is something you can return to, and when you're starting a new book and you want to refresh your mind on it, like, okay, I'm going to come up with some sub characters. How can we really ground them and make them compelling and sharp and interesting, compelling, and addictive to the reader? And so to recap, the 3 keys, in our opinion, to make your sub-character compelling is give them backstory. Let us know where they come from, what makes them tick, and why. Give them internal conflict. What is it? What is that thing in their life that's the most important to them? And what is driving them forward? And give them a goal of their own outside of just the main character's goal. Make them feel real. Let them be the main character of their own story, even if they're not the main character of the book, and let their paths cross with the main character. And their story should help to move the story as a whole forward, and it should matter to the main protagonist.
Yeah, solid points. Definitely great things to remember. Key ingredients to writing really realistic and lovable side characters. And again, don't forget to check out my training on this subject, which you can find at patreon.com/Abbie Emmons if you want to get access to that, plus a bunch of awesome other live trainings and all my future ones. Super great community in there. But thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed it and got some value out of it. Drop a comment below and tell us what you thought. We would love to hear from you guys. We love to hear your feedback. Also, share with us some of your favorite story examples of great side characters that you love. We'd love to hear about those as well. Thank you again to our supporters over at Patreon. If you get value out of this podcast, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show and help us keep this podcast alive and free of interruptions. Until next time,
stay stoked
and rock on.